do men want?
Manifests itself in relationships, and you feel it in relationships, and they can be very powerful spiritually. And if that's what you need, that's what you should go for.
And she said, oh, I'm going to go do a sweat lodge this evening. And I begged her to take me along, and that was about 6 years ago.
Welcome to Speaking of Men. You're watching public access television from Albuquerque, New Mexico. I am your host, Mike Rivas. Our guest in the studio today is Jim Sims, who is a therapist and counselor here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and we're talking about anger and divorce and attaching or detaching from that anger and divorce. Welcome to the program, Jim.
Thank you, sir.
I guess how we got into this discussion was the fact that I know myself and a great number of men who go through divorces get locked into fury and hatred and anger and a certain amount of emotional hysteria, which is a part of divorce. But in some situations, it seems that it goes way beyond what is appropriately an appropriate amount of anger for that. You want to open up and expand on it a little bit?
Sure. I think that when you start talking about divorce, you're talking about a death of a relationship. When you start talking about a death of a relationship, you start talking about death in general. You start talking about grieving. The grieving process is, there's a normal grieving process. I would suppose in the death of a relationship, you're probably looking at a grieving process maybe taking 1 to 2 years with time spent. There'll be times, say 5 or 10 years later, that you'll finish up part of the grieving, and there'll be a part of you that'll be saying goodbye to that relationship probably forever. But I think that if a man, after 3 or 4 years of divorce, is still getting up in the morning and shaving and looking in the mirror and seeing his ex-wife and hating her, you know, then he needs maybe not to look at so much of what his ex-wife is doing, what she's doing, the behavior she's acting out, but his anger. He needs to look at his anger. Anger is part of the grieving process.
Sometimes I think you were telling me in an earlier discussion that sometimes the anger is left over from something that happened separate from the divorce or from the relationship with the ex-wife, and it's somehow become a part. You're not following
no.
me. I guess, okay, let me ask it this way. Do you have any guidelines that someone could approach to figuring what is an appropriate amount of anger and emotion for this, and what is inappropriate?
I think
Is that what you just explained to me?
I may have. I think that anytime you start talking about the anger in a divorce, I think men are going to be angry because it's a death of a relationship. I think that when we start talking about violence in the grieving process, that's probably inappropriate. I think that if we start looking at a divorce, and what happens is when men, I don't know that women do it. I can't really speak to women's anger. I know that women get angry, but since we're talking about men's anger on the show, when men get angry, they have to win.
So seeing it as a win-lose situation is a mistake.
Oh, especially if there's children involved. Because if you look at it as a win-lose situation, if you're not winning, then the situation, you know, if you're not winning, you are losing. And you have to go and go and go and go until you ultimately win. And lots of times, if you're doing that go and go and go until you win, the children are losing.
So it's the idea of getting stuck in it as a battle.
Yeah.
And at some point you have to make an assessment and figure it's over with, and this is what happened, and get on with a new life, sort of. How can men take care of themselves in situations like this? You know, you're locked. You're going through a divorce. You haven't seen your children in a couple of months. You have. I was thinking about the other day. I was talking to a friend of mine. Here he is. He's fighting for trying to find work. He's been in this custody battle. His health has been suffering. He's got a judge he's dealing with, some sort of a court-appointed person. He's got his attorney, her attorney, and her, you know, and almost all of these people, not to mention the child. So, you know, this is a huge number of people who are causing extreme chaos in this man's life.
Okay.
Right? And he's feeling this.
Okay.
And so what would be some steps that a man could take to begin to deal with that? I know you'd mentioned support groups as one.
Okay. I can tell you what I do and what I advise men that I work with and am around to do. Find a couple of people, find a group, a support group, find somebody. It can be a professional therapist, it can be just a good friend, and keep some sort of a ongoing relationship with them. Just kind of talk their way through it. A couple of other things I think they might want to do. Diet. These are maybe a bit simplistic. I think that if you're under that much stress that you're talking about, probably what you're going to want to do is you're going to start watch your diet, watch what you eat, try to work out a little bit. There are a lot of things that you can do to deal with this sort of stress. It's just good mental health things. But we were talking earlier about some of the things. I certainly get angry and I certainly grieve. And one of the things I did was I had a set of dishes, and I'm sure my neighbors thought I was nuts. I went out in the backyard and I broke them all one by one up against the wall because I was really, really, really angry, and I needed to do that. It didn't hurt anybody else. I wasn't really even scaring anybody else. There wasn't anybody around.
Well, I've heard people talk about taking sticks and beating pillows with them, or do you think that works? It actually gets some of the...
Probably does. It's probably some sort of a, you know, you just dump it. It worked for me. But again, I guess I knew what I was doing because I was taking my anger in the cup and I would break it. And when I knew I was going to do that too. I knew I was going to go out and dump my anger. I was very, very, very angry. I would go out and break a cup. And
well, it's some of this that we're talking about is the images that we get as men, and of course of ourselves, and our ideas of what it is to be a man. And of course, it's fairly new in male discussions for guys to be able to admit they're angry or that they're hurt. Or, you know, most of us have, a lot of guys still, I'm sure, just get that numb, stiff upper lip, this don't bother me, I'm going to have another shot of whiskey here and go right on down the road and I'll survive it, didn't hurt me a bit. And so this admitting anger is a big deal. Can you talk a little bit about how men see each other, stereotypically maybe, and how we can begin to see ourselves a little more healthily?
I'm not sure how we always see each other. I think we kind of see ourselves, we're programmed almost to be that cowboy type, Hemingway type character who is totally self-sufficient, who totally, who can totally take care of himself. And he's certainly not going to, if I am Hemingway and a cowboy, John Wayne, I'm not going to spill my guts to you. Whether I'm going to talk about anger or pain, and they're very closely related. A lot of times when you're talking about anger, you're also talking about pain. But I'm not, if I am John Wayne and Ernest Hemingway, I'm not going to spill my guts to you. I'm just going to carry that around. I'm just going to carry it around. Men die, what? Right now, the latest statistics I saw was that men die an average of 10 years younger than women.
And it was roughly equal in 1900.
Okay, yeah, right. Okay, but
so we've lost 10 years,
yeah.
men have.
And the reason that I think a lot of that is because we internalize it. We internalize it. We have only, say, within the past, say, 30 or 40 years, learned that we can use our intellect to work with our emotions. You and I talked about fear. Sometimes I'll get caught up in something that I'm going to do, and I'll say to myself, well, I'm not going to be afraid of that. I'm just going to go do it. It's a scary thing. It'll be scary. And I'll say, well, I'm not afraid of that. I'm just going to go do it. And I'll go do it, and as I start to do it, and one side of my brain, I'm telling myself, it's not scary. And then the other side of my brain is saying, who are you kidding, Sims? This is really scary. And I'll start doing that, and I'll get all confused and wired and angry and anxious. And if I'll stop and say, Sims, this is really spooky, this is scary, and I'll admit that I'm scared.
Now this, what you're talking about here, and this little process you're describing, now this is an emotional problem-solving skill, right?
Sure.
So, and men
okay.
don't have a lot of those, huh?
Okay. Okay. If I will admit, a lot of times I'm like a lot of men, and we get caught up in the fact that we can't admit that we're afraid, even though the situation is scary. Once I'll say to myself, this is scary, Sims, I'm afraid, then it's okay. But I have to admit that I'm afraid. And what's really interesting is once I admit that I'm afraid, the fear goes away. Or once that I admit that I'm angry, if I can say, well, Sims, I'm angry. What are you angry about? And then I sit down and figure it out, then a lot of times the anger will go away. And the fear will too. But it has to do with acknowledging it.
So that's. Do you have some other emotional? So acknowledgement is certainly a part of it. You got some other examples of problem-solving skills that in dealing with emotions, which is something that I guess we're trying to learn to do.
Well, we start talking about. I would talk about what I do. Maybe.
Well, that's fine. Let's do that.
What I did when I. What I did when I got divorced is I knew, since I know part of the grieving process, I knew that if I didn't cry, I just had to cry, because if I wasn't, I was going to go nuts, and it's still painful. I went home and put on some old music that was ours, and I was just sitting there listening to it, and I fell on the floor and I just cried and cried and cried. I needed to do that. And when I got up, it was better than it was when I started. But for me to deny the tears and the pain, it wasn't healthy.
I can almost count, since I've been 16, 17 years old, I think that I've actually been able to cry, where you had, I don't know if catharsis is the word, but where you had some kind of a release, maybe 3 or 4 times. And and that's been over a 25, 30-year period. So being able to cry is a real gift. I'm wondering. Let's just, for the hell of it, talk a little bit about the way men see women, the way we see women. You got some things to say on that, could you? I mean, I know, it's like we were talking, you were saying, that old cowboy mentality, we see women as subservient. Mm-hmm. And they're sure as hell not in 1990.
No. That's really interesting. I was thinking about that. I've been thinking about that since we started this conversation. We go around dealing, in 1992, we go around with our cowboy and John Wayne image, and we go around dealing with women in 1992 the same way the cowboys did back on the frontier. Well, and the cowmen did. The way we deal with women are either that they were up on a total pedestal and not human beings, or they were do it. And they were some sort of a subservient animal. A lot of us still, and it's still in there. A lot of us do that. We expect our women to, and a part of us does.
Does it seem to make the ones you know mad?
Yeah, and then what you get into are those battles. You get into those battles because we men.
Now this is that we did a show one time. What the problem here is we get into one up, one down, right? And because again we're walking into the world of emotion and dealing with women, which men don't know a whole bunch about.
Yeah.
And as soon as you get a little bit of anger going,
Yeah.
you get a little bit of afraid, then you get a little bit of anger, and then you kick one up. Is that what you were telling me?
Yeah, but one of the things that's interesting, and this has to do with not so much men or women, it has to do with the system. It has to do with the system that we get caught up in. I think a lot of women's self-esteem is caught up in how many, watch this, a lot of women's self-esteem is caught up in having male children. So once they have a male child, that male child becomes kind of her center of the universe because, again, her self-esteem, and this goes way back to the tribes, but her self-esteem is caught up in having male children. She has a male child, so what she does is she takes care of him. And she takes care of him, and she gives, and she never really teaches him to do anything because she's always doing it for him. So then what happens is you have this child, and that happens and happens and happens, and then all of a sudden he's 17 or 18 years old, and he's growing up, and lo and behold, the rest of the world is not treating him like his mother did. So two things happen. She hasn't taught him any skills. She hasn't taught him any coping skills. So what he does is the best thing he can do is anger is so easy for him to do. So the two things he does is he learns to be angry. He doesn't. That's just the first thing that he does. He becomes angry when he gets frustrated because the rest of the world is not treating him like his mother did. In other words, solving everything for him. He gets really frustrated, and when you get frustrated, the easiest thing to do is get angry.
Right.
But it's not anything that either of them are doing wrong. It's just the system that they're caught up in.
Right.
And we men being caught up in that system of thinking we always have to be one up and that we're the top of the world, we lose on that. We lose relationships. We die 10 years earlier. In not taking care of ourselves, we've got a lot to lose.
So, one of the horses that we beat with a stick on this program regularly is the fact that men and women can't get together as adults and save the children in the divorce, who are the real product of this society, the emotional pain and damage. I mean, we have a group of people in their 35 to 45, 50-year-old range who suffered extreme emotional abuse. I mean, if you can believe John Bradshaw and all those guys in the 10,000 books on self-help and recovery and reclaiming the inner child and all the things that happen, a lot of our generation suffered terribly when we were youngsters emotionally. A lot of that is the offshoot of children being caught, between two adults. Mm-hmm. So I guess I'm long-windedly asking you, what are some things that a man and a woman walking into a divorce can do to save the children and to make it a little bit better?
Get out of the win-win. Get out of the fact that somebody has to be a winner and somebody has to be a loser. And I don't get the feeling that women get caught up in that so much. And again, I don't really feel comfortable in talking about what women need to do.
Well, I'm not asking you.
Okay, but I think what men need to do is to get out of that I've got to win. And if I don't win, things are going to be terrible, and it can only be my way. One of the
has to be unconditional surrender.
Yeah, because that's just the way, again, that's the way we look at it.
Well, you know, talking about fathers on it then, you know, speaking for men, letting women speak for themselves, how can a dad approach a child if he's in a divorce? He's seeing the kid less often, there's some emotions. What do you think the child might be experiencing? Or how do you approach that situation? There's a divorce, you have the youngster there, you haven't seen him in 2 weeks or a month or 6 weeks. The child is a little emotionally off. I mean, how does a dad deal with that? Do you have any insights?
I think that's difficult for men if they're not going to admit to their emotions. I think that one of the things we men need to do with our children of a divorce is if they're talking, you know, if the men are in pain, they need to tell their children that they're in pain, so that the children will start to understand what's going on. I think that.
So you're saying be honest, not shield.
Yeah. If a father, but kids are going to pick up on it anyway. Mm-hmm. If a father hasn't seen his son or daughter for a long time, or not seeing him on a regular basis, there's a couple of things that the child doesn't need to happen. The father doesn't need the father needs to have quality time with his children. And I don't really think that the children want to hear him badmouth his ex. If the child is going to be there for a weekend, the dad doesn't need to badmouth the ex or the judges or the attorneys or the system. The kid just doesn't need to hear it.
Because that involves the child.
Yeah,
right?
The kid has got. I mean, you got to figure out if we're looking at this. If we are looking at this as a divorce is a situation where a man and a woman couldn't get together, and what we're trying to do is get out of it as best we can, then let's do the least amount of damage to the children that we can. Let's do the best job of taking care of the children that we can. And that may mean sacrificing some of our I've got to win. You know, again, if you get into the divorce as a I've got to win thing, then the kids will be sacrificed.
I think it's important for men to realize that you might go from seeing your child every day to seeing your child every 2 weeks, or whatever the court decides. You know, more and more people are fighting for joint custody. That's kind of a new thing. I know that some law enforcement people in the legal profession are looking at trying to create a better chance of a mediation of a divorce to avoid all of that crazy-making kinds of blame and loss of finances and emotional hysteria that usually accompanies that. But you're in it for the long run. If your child is 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, and you're probably going to know that child for another 25, 30 years. So that quality time can, in the long run, heal a lot of that wounding of the. I mean, it's definitely, you're in a bad situation, and it's hard to make it a good one if you're in a divorce. If a family is disintegrating, everybody's going to hurt a little bit. So what we're talking about here is how not to hurt so much, and if you can get out of that crazy, I've got to win this right now, you did this to me, blah, 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 I want some vengeance, whatever, and look at it like I'm going to know my child for another 25 years, you can turn it into a lot more of a win-win situation if you can get that perspective, can't you?
Yeah,
what do I know, right?
I don't, you know.
I'm just, it's my experience.
Well, I'm going to tell you what I did, and which I think was a pretty good way to do it. But then I worry about doing that, because if I say that I did this is a good way to do it, I've certainly got my problems. But what I did about my son Pete, my ex and I were just fighting all the time, and it wasn't going to work. And I looked at her one day and I said to her, "You can have anything you want except me," and I walked out the door. And I refused to, what was going to happen is I saw what it was doing to my son. And it was just tearing him up. And there wasn't any reason for it. We weren't going to get along. She wasn't going to bend. I couldn't stay in the situation, but there was no need for me to win it. I didn't need to win it. Why win it? I didn't want to live with her. I didn't want to stay with her. I didn't see fighting with her. There wasn't any reason to fight. What was I going to fight about? It was over, and there was no sense of me trying to fight over. I'm not any sort of a hippie. There wasn't any sense of us trying to fight over furniture or cars or property or any of the rest of it. It wasn't worth it. All that was happening was Pete's head was getting screwed around terribly. I wasn't going to win. I wasn't going to win the battle. It wasn't going to be won. And the only thing that I could do was step back, and Pete was 4 or 5. It's marvelous when he's here. He's 16 now. It's marvelous. We don't have the time. We didn't have that day-to-day stuff, but I think our relationship is a lot better at 16 now than it would have been if she and I would have fought for those 11 years. I think his head is in a better place now than it would have been if Marilyn and I would have fought for those 11 years, because that's what we would have done.
Robert Moore talks about the fact that the most important message that the child should get from the father is that, it's what's the one from the New Testament about, this is my son in whom I'm well pleased. Mm-hmm. And I think that the child needs to know primarily that you love them and you care about them, and have a chance of understanding the circumstances, mm-hmm. that they're not being abandoned, that you are there, that though you may not be there physically, you can be there emotionally, financially, and you can spend some time together. You have a little workshop coming up. Jim, you want to talk about that a little bit? This will be Thursday, June the 4th, 6:30 to 8:30.
Oh, at the YMCA.
Uh-huh.
What we're going to talk about, the way the frontier has affected men, how it's affected our relationship with other men, and how it affects our relationships with women. Again, we're going to talk about a lot of us are still working out of the 19th century, and we're relating to women, well, actually everybody, the way men did in the 19th century.
Well, what number? Give me the number they could call if they needed information on it real quick.
265-7460.
Jim, I'd like to thank you for coming down and seeing us. My name is Mike Rivas. This is Speaking of Men. We hope that you'll join us in the future. Please come see us again. Stand if you can, run if you have to, but whatever you do, don't quit. Bye-bye.